Hello everyone, it's Silas from AsianCultureVulture.com. We're outside Tate Britain and we're here for an exhibition, Women in Revolt, 1970 to 1990, Art and Activism. There's an amazing array of artists, more than 100. There are many South Asian and black women featured here. We're going to be talking to artists Pratibha Palmer and Sutapa Biswas, and we're going to be talking to the curator Inga Fraser about what we can find here.
You never told me that my grandmother had been this extraordinary feminist. And you never told me that she'd been a devotee of Kali.
Sutapa, welcome to AsianCultureVulture.com. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Good stuff. So talk to us about this amazing, which is still, like, I think she's going to come out and chop my head off right now. But what was the kind of trigger for this work?
Well, it was made, I made this work between 1983 and 1985. And it was really a work that emerged at a time when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Leeds in Yorkshire, the UK, and I made it at a period in history when there was very limited, if any, kind of art criticism that looked beyond the realm of artistic practice and histories outside of what we understand today to be the global north. And so as a student who I was born in India. I came to this country when I was 4 years of age and grew up in really a working class community. My father had been an academic in India. We left India because of his political differences with Congress at the time. And, it was, I think, the 70s and the 80s and even before that was a very charged period in British history. And it was charged for several reasons, but one of the things that I think is important to remember is that I began my undergraduate study in 1981, and that was the same year that we had seen parts of the country erupt in flames and protests. In fact, I grew up in a part of London where the National Front, the British far-right party at the time, had been doing protests along the main arterial roads where I lived. And in Southall, just before I started my course, indeed, there was a fascist band called an Oi band who played in our local pub with kind of the consent, if you like, the protection of the then government, even though there was resistance and there were protests to their playing there, understandably so, but they went and played there anyway. And I think in the history of this particular community, it was like the last straw. So the Southall Asian resistance movement protested, and in actual fact, they burnt that tavern down. Now, this also prompted, riots that took place in Brixton, in Toxteth, in different parts of Birmingham. So it was a very charged period in history where, violence against black people, the Afro-Asian communities, the migrant diasporic communities, and communities who were of, African and South Asian parentage, were really being intimidated and, if you like, oppressed by mainstream culture. And it was against this background that I found myself going to university, having come from a history where where my parents had experienced partition of India, and where my father himself had been, if you like, although he was an academic, very much vocal and an activist in the partition moment in India. So, I grew up with literature of a wide range, whether it was Kant or Wittgenstein or Lukács, so I arrived at my university course, fine art and art history, if you like, with this sort of, with this knowledge already. And so when I arrived in 1981 and I realized when I was looking at Turner's The Slave Ship or at Manet's Olympia, that even though it was a very radical, it considered itself to be a Marxist, feminist, post-structuralist course, there was no real discourse around or dialogue around the history of imperialism. There was no real engagement with questions of capital in relation to labour and labour forces who, if you like, had originally come from the colonies, from this extraordinary and very complex and brutal history. So as I was looking at The Slave Ship by Turner or Manet's Olympia, whereas my tutors were saying, let's look at the use and the palette, the expressionistic nature of the brush strokes, and how, and it is an extraordinary painting without doubt, one wouldn't question that. Why is it that we're not talking about what's in the water and what was obviously a slave that had been thrown overboard, and also what seemed to be quite precious cargo? So I was asking these questions, saying, why aren't we looking at art history? Why aren't we decolonizing art history? In a way, we didn't have that term at that stage.
No.
So I was beginning to say to my tutors, well, if I'm able to read and critique these artworks in this way, you need to change the course. Why aren't you doing it? So I began to think about the ways in which I could challenge art historical narratives that were very dominant and very much part of, even though it was a radical course, it was more part of the mainstream at the time. And the way that I felt one could do that was really by bringing together iconography and narratives and imagery that came outside, that originated from outside of that a European and North American sort of global north trajectory, to narratives and iconography and stories and experiences from the global south.
What did you draw on to create this?
Well, I drew on the fact that I was familiar with this iconography, and that whereas in the media at the time we were portrayed as these, mainstream media, we were portrayed as Asian women as these meek, kind of voiceless people, I felt very much in opposition to that. I just thought, well, all of the icons that I've grown up with, and within my own sort of familial structure, the female voice was very powerful. So I began to draw upon, iconography that came from Hindu mythological sources. And here we have a four-armed image of a woman. She is a woman. She's drawn from the deity Kali, and Kali means black goddess. So I drew upon these kind of source material, if you like, and brought it together and against, for example, the white in the background is a reference to a very, very famous series of paintings by an artist called Robert Rauschenberg called the White Paintings. And I also have in this collage an image of a reproduction of an image by the artist, extraordinary artist Artemisia Gentileschi, who herself had experienced rape in her lifetime. It's a kind of incantation to the strong voices and spirits and mythological characters that we have known historically, even where they are just mythologies, and set it against, you know, this white background which references Rauschenberg's series of works, you know, in the kind of history of modernism, Western modernism, in art historical terms, by saying, well, this is what was visible to me in that metaphorical white institutional space. And so that's really how this work came about.
Yeah. And
the tunic that she's wearing, actually there's a nice story to that, because it draws from, you know, a Miss Selfridge top that I bought at the time as a student, and that I used to wear, you know, on a frequent...
Was it like one of your favourite tops?
It was, yeah. Right, I still have it, actually. It doesn't fit me anymore, but I still have it, you know. And what was interesting was the design on it is kind of ikat, you know. And I realised when I returned to India for the first time after 19 years that, and I didn't know this when I made it, that my grandmother, who'd been very key in my upbringing in India when I was born, had been very widely known in that district as being the strongest devotee of Kali.
Oh, wow.
But not because she was orthodox religious, more because she was a feminist prototype.
Oh, wow.
And so this kind of extraordinary history, I think, it sat with me. You know, when I saw an image of a print that she'd left for me, she'd passed away by the time sadly, by the time I went back to India, but in this print, screen print, she had the icon, Kali, was wearing a tunic that was quite similar to this design. And of course, when I came back to England, I said to my mum, you never told me that my grandmother had been this extraordinary feminist. And you never told me that she'd been a devotee of Kali, or, you know. And my mum actually said, well, you know, when I first saw your work at the Thin Black Line exhibition that was curated by Lubaina Himid at the ICA in 1985, she said, I just assumed you knew. The question about the Global South, it is beginning to happen in a much more serious way. And I think that's a very positive thing. So I think Lindsay Young, who's curated this exhibition, it takes a village, you know, with the support of artists and curators and, you know, the public, people right across the Tate and other institutions, has been, it's an imperative exhibition. And it's really important to see the beauty and the sheer determination and the sheer strength of female voice that has played such a huge, significant role to not only challenging the cultural frameworks that we live with, but to creating beauty and complexity and magic.
Absolutely.
On every level.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Oh, God,
my pleasure.
Wonderful.